Welcome to this week's episode of Zero to a Million, brought to you by Unstack. I'm your host, Zach Rego, and today I'm joined by Jonathon Hensley, co-founder and CEO of Emerge, a digital product consulting firm that works with companies to improve operational agility and customer experience. Also, author of Alignment, Overcome Internal Sabotage and Digital Product Failure. Today, we're going to be going deep on exactly that, really building a digital business and digital products and helping scale them. Jonathon, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Zach.
Yeah, really excited to dig into this. I guess before we get into the topic of the day, would love to get a little bit of your background. Obviously, you've got, most recent experience author, previously, experience being as co-founder and CEO, or currently co-founder and CEO of Emerge. What led you to this point and really where you are today?
Well, I've been in the digital product space for over 2 decades now. I'm originally a Silicon Valley native, and so I grew up right in the heart of all this amazing innovation taking place. And really what hooked me in early on was trying to understand how technology influences our daily lives and the way that we work. So my passion grew into wanting to understand behavioral psychology and how we really leverage technology to create value. And that turned into a bunch of jobs and eventually founding Emerge, and so that we could continue to work with companies, whether they're startups or Fortune 100 brands all over the world, to help them create and deliver digital products and services.
So a lot of our customers and our audience, right, they're either in the throes of building a digital product and pre-launch, and they're acquiring, waitlist or beta users. So there's a lot of opportunity for you to help them not make mistakes that can be costly. Others are at that scale phase, right? They've got traction, they're starting to pour fuel on the fire, and that's typically when the pitfalls get exposed. So what do leaders need to know when launching a digital product, and what are those top pitfalls that you're usually helping people either pull out of or hopefully avoid?
Well, I think we see a lot of commonality where they started with an original idea or understanding of the problem, and as they've entered the marketplace, or they're about to enter the marketplace at their earlier stage, is that some of their core assumptions around their customers and what drives value were inaccurate. And so where we're coming in is we're looking at what are the actual value drivers and motivations of the core customer for the product, and then how is that being reflected and mirrored within the operations and strategy for that product going forward, so you can make fast and effective decisions as you iterate and improve the product and find market fit.
So something I've always found challenging, be it at Unstack more recently, much smaller, agile team, or in my previous role as general manager of a much bigger division with a lot of resources, interviewing customers or potential customers, you seem to get a lot of positive feedback, right? To me, it always feels like we're on the right track, we're on the right track, we're on the right track. And sometimes the product goes live and we were on the right track and it feels perfect. But I still feel like there's always a little bit of bias when you're asking questions on the front end to vet out a product, and then when you go live with it, it feels like, wait a minute, this fell a little bit flatter than we expected. Any strategies to avoid that kind of falling flat and that testing that needs to continue to iterate really quickly in your kind of information gathering phase?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you're touching on, first and foremost, a core thing that happens whether you're sitting in a leadership position and you're the owner or founder of a company, or you're in the thick of it with the product team at any level, is this idea of confirmation bias. And so this idea that we naturally seek out people and information that confirm our beliefs. And so this is a known thing in psychology and something that product teams constantly have to find ways to overcome. And one of the best tools that you can do to help you shift from that place of bias is to shift and focus on empathy. So when design thinking and customer experience, right, that's empathy is a core pillar of doing that kind of work, and it has to be foundational in strategy as well as in product design and execution when you think about how you're going to engage and validate things with customers. You also have to take into account that there are tactics that sometimes will lead to bias information. And so a good example of that is, a lot of businesses like the idea of like net promoter score. great statistic for the right use case, but it's not always really that well understood. And so what things like Net Promoter Score are actually measuring is a transactional moment in the experience, typically. And then it's also giving you an incomplete picture of the actual disposition or perceptions of that user in that moment. And so what happens is you're not actually given a good predictor of value or retention, which are going to be critical to the product success. So you have to look at broader, more key metrics that holistically capture the sum of the experience that you're trying to take customers through and are articulating the value more clearly. And then you can frame better and more effective question and research to go along with that. One of my favorite little tricks to do is to remove that is instead of asking them about the product that you're creating, ask them about the product they chose to solve the solution in the past. What did they love about it? And people do like to give more positive feedback in general than negative. And if you can shift the narrative, what you're doing is you're creating a safe place where there is no friction or tension between you and the potential customer or existing customer to have that level of disclosure in an open and safe environment. And so when you can do that, you psychologically open up the space for much, much more insightful data.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think digging into what they're doing, I think the other thing that I've found challenging is getting people to really go back to like the buying moment of the product they bought. So like, what was that? What was the reason you bought it or the problem you were solving? Because I think that evolves as you're a customer of a product. Is there a metric that you look at to feel like, and you mentioned NPS as one that you maybe don't, but is there a metric that you would look at with a customer 1 month, 2 month, 3 months into a product launch to say, hey, we're hitting the nail on the head here? Because you're not going to quite have that like churn and net retention stats ironed out at that point. So I'd be interested to hear like what you're digging into quickly to be agile and make
Sure.
refinements.
So what we like to do is there's not like a single metric that's like universal across products, but from a structural perspective, there's a pretty common spread that we can look at. And so, for example, what we'll want to look at is understanding what is the main value and benefit for, adopting the product. And then once they've gone from first time user, what happens once they start to become a habitual user over a short period of time? The initial value might have been actually delivered within, just the first week of use of the product. And then all of a sudden the problem isn't as acute anymore. And they've actually shifted away. And all of a sudden you start to see logins and engagement within your feature set drop off. And that's really difficult for a product team to see that. But what is most often happening is there's either a lack of onboarding education of here's the broader feature set and where your areas of opportunity are, or there has been a lack of reinforcement of the total benefit, and that the fact that most products can have a cumulative benefit over time and with ongoing usage. And so there's usually a mix in there that we can analyze and find where there's going to be opportunity to re-engage and connect with that customer to drive long-term lifetime value if we can keep them engaged.
So, thinking about optimizing kind of that piece, right? You start to see the drop off in, we'll say, weekly active users in this scenario. First 3 weeks, super active. You start to see, weekly active users is down, monthly active users, okay. How do you go about re-engaging? And I think you mentioned a point of like onboarding features that probably have a better recurring value. How do you reinforce that value? What tools or tips or tricks have you worked with clients to execute on that?
Well, the toolbox is kind of never ending and the way it's growing, but I think that it comes from the way that you communicate. You had another guest on that recently talked about product-led growth. Product-led growth is a phenomenal strategy, but it requires a lot of critical thinking around the support structures in the overall experience to be the most effective that it can be. And there's still a human element that always is critical to product-led growth companies. And OpenView talks a lot about this, who coined the term of product-led growth. There's this mechanism of, I go back to the behavioral side. So where are the opportunities to create feedback loops? to acknowledge successful completion and uses of features or tasks within the application. Where are there opportunities to prompt where if they have been focused within a specific feature or set of features that are there to accomplish a core task and solve the problem that you've adopted the product to do? Well, usually there's a whole another series of features and benefits that are associated to that, and that connection is not always intuitive. So how do you create more intuitive connections to the other features and benefits of the product? And so you can think of it in terms of guided experiences, leveled learning. Adult learning mechanisms are phenomenal in that, making sure there's feedback loops, transparency and progress and progression through the application, and recommunication and iteration of the value. This becomes even more essential when you think about the separation between the user and the buyer. So in most cases of B2B products, the user and the buyer are two different individuals or groups within an organization. And so that reinforcement and that abstraction needs to be extremely clear, because you have users building justification for continued usage and retention of the product. And so you need to provide that at the product level. We can't assume that customers are willing or can do that heavy lifting without our help.
So users is an interesting one. I've been doing a ton of research on actually solving the problem we're talking about. So I'm going to selfishly ask a couple questions that'll benefit me and hopefully our audience. We've started to really find, right, that there are more users getting involved in the onboarding than we initially expected. So in our free trial, we had gated it to one user, and we were like, well, this is a hang up, right? Because there's going to potentially be a designer, a copywriter in just the website build. And then the ongoing user might be one or two people. So we've opened that up, but with that shift, we've had to change our email marketing a little bit, because now these users are coming to us with a very different lens on what we do. Some of them are performance marketers. They're thinking conversion rate, A/B testing landing pages. Some of them are designers. They're thinking, beautiful animations and how do I create a structure with this size image and this size form. How have you advised clients? And I'm sure you've worked with some enterprise clients, so they're probably going after an entire organization from C level all the way down to director, to engage with these different users at different parts of the organization and effectively provide kind of that value to them.
So I think that there's a couple of key things there. One is really understanding what's the value of your product to each role in executing, for example, the website. That's a very different understanding. And the great thing is that the total benefit needs to ladder up to the main driver of your customer base, right? But all of the supporting benefits need to be role specific if you have that kind of distributed audience that has to be involved, or is process of becoming part of a trial and an evaluation and eventual selection of your product. I mean, so you need to have that process. In B2B sales, Gartner's done a phenomenal amount of research around this, but there's this constant process from the moment they identify the problem and they start understanding the scope of potential solutions, and then evaluation and selection of this constant work stream happening of building consensus and reaffirmation that the problem is significant enough to make the investment to solve. And so by making sure you have clear communication and positioning of the cumulative benefit and then the individual, and then clarity on the roles and their benefits becomes really, really important. It also happens to be an issue with what's your growth strategy for your product. All right. So if it's a bottom-up growth strategy where you really are counting on, for let's say, a copywriter trying to find this platform that can really empower them to do their job and then collaborate across their team, then you need to make the platform and the proposition clear on how they can do that and invite members of the team to do that. And then eventually it's a no-brainer for leadership to say, let's write the check for that, because the team is already invested in the solution. And so a great product example of that is Slack. Slack is a bottom-up growth company. They've done a phenomenal job of that. Dropbox is another really good example. So in, I guess it would be 2019 roughly, they removed the paywall. And this was really controversial at the time. Why would you remove the paywall? Well, because they realized that the paywall was an inhibitor to the user. and their growth strategy was bottom up user base. But Dropbox is only a valuable tool if you have multiple people to share assets with. So the goal is how do we get teams to invest into our product, upload a certain amount of files, and then start collaborating. Then they could directly go to somebody with, buying power and say, look, we're already using this. It's really helping our efficiency. Do you mind paying for this version so we can keep using it? Otherwise, we're going to have to find another tool and start over. Well, now you have leadership going, well, that's a no-brainer. It's a tool you love. You've already vetted it out. You're using it. You're collaborating. You're more effective, and you're off to the races. So when you think about, these tactics and strategies, understanding first the motivations and behavior, making sure that's aligned very clearly with what your growth strategy and intentions are, and then making sure those benefits are clearly communicated, and you understand the moments, the signature moments and actions that those users need to take to fulfill their needs to adopt your solution become key. And then you can start to amplify that, and you can see that, multiply again and again and again, because you have a common set of behaviors that you can build marketing and sales tactics around.
So I love the Dropbox example. I love the Slack example as well. Those are similar. We've got to be able to track what these folks are doing, to take the data-driven insights to, score effectively and know where our value is being added and what these folks are doing. There are so many tools companies can use today to, one, build a website, drive traffic, optimize the copy, create in-product onboarding flows, create post-sales onboarding flows, right? And these can all be very different tools. But how have you advised your clients when they're kind of going to market with digital products to think about tool implementation to help streamline their customers' experience or prospects' experience, and also the data that they're able to ingest, understand?
You're right. There's so many possible tools now out there for, these different aspects. One of the core things that we run into, I would say most often, is either an approach to kind of general analytics, which tend to be kind of light in their, what I would just say, actionable insight, or especially past the login point, if you're, in a logged in and within the product itself, or if you're dealing with, do you actually know what elements and events to track within your product, like which ones are value drivers themselves. And so where we start with most of the work that we do, and we advise most people to start with as well, if they don't already have a mature analytics practice in place, is to understand what are all of the product flows, and then what are the actual intended outcomes of each flow being completed successfully, and then what would be the assigned KPI to that flow. And so then you can start to look at, well, if this flow is critical to these 10 pieces of our application, and we're seeing this one flow underperform, we have something actionable and clear of this was our intended outcome. Why are we not able to achieve this? Now we have enough information and we can start to diagnose and problem solve. And I think that's the challenge that you see in a lot of analytics, is it's not giving you enough information to know where to start to prioritize and focus your efforts. And so you need to have that clear map of, these are the actual, flows and tasks associated within my product. These are the actual moments that need to be tracked and the intended outcomes, so that all parties involved, whether a UX designer, an engineer, or product manager, can look at it and start to assess and diagnose the challenges of continuous improvement. And that's where we really see a foundational element of needing to focus in most cases.
Interesting. Yeah, I think you mentioned kind of post login, right? That's a huge challenge. I think, I at my previous job at WordStream, we, had a great application. I was running the agency business, which had a bunch of users logging into a bunch of different accounts. So even our, we used Mixpanel at the time, but, even our Mixpanel data was so messy to spend time trying to organize it, to understand weekly active users, monthly active users, but more importantly, which accounts were they logging into and what were they doing? Like every account had a different makeup. So it was like, we were just going through data, and they make it actionable and insights, but every company has so many challenges once you're in a product. I think Where we maybe dropped the ball early is not setting this up on the beginning, right? We didn't set this up until we were 6, 7 years into, really building a pretty meaningful business. And it's like, damn, what could we have done faster had we have known some of these things sooner? We probably wouldn't have built tools that we spent time building, and we would have doubled down in other areas.
One of the amazing things about the tools that are out there is they're so powerful and they are actually pretty easy to implement. The challenge that comes with it is after you implement, the hooks to utilize these, different tools and packages to track and measure the performance of your product, you're still responsible for creating the taxonomy and structures within your product and identifying the events that need to be tracked in order to drive your business forward. And so there's this element of responsibility that I think is sometimes not clearly defined in when a product like that is chosen. It's positioned to be very easy, and it is, but you still have some pretty heavy lifting to do, which requires true command and control of your product. And that very often is difficult, and especially if you're inheriting a product that has gone through multiple iterations. The decision-making process of why things work a certain way may not be clear anymore, or the business may have evolved to such a place where some of those things that were decided to be important are no longer important, or they're purely just lagging indicators. They don't give you any predictive intelligence to actually drive critical decision-making in advance of your users. And that's what can be very detrimental. I mean, companies like Zynga, as an example, I wrote about this actually in my book, interviewing Chris Cravens, who was the founding CIO of Zynga. He talked about they had critical metrics that were like the canaries in the coal mine scenario. They knew key metrics at any time if these things happen, what the ripple effect would be across the entire business. So as those key metrics were being influenced and changing with the way that customers were behaving or networks were performing, they knew exactly what they needed to do, and the team would get to work on those things. And so that takes a lot of work to get to that level of refinement and understanding of your business. And it's not easy. And so I think what's important to know is that anybody, whether they're starting, it's okay to not have it in place. Just know that that is something to aspire to get to, that it's really critical. And there are huge companies that are still struggling to get there. But everybody's working towards that as, a best-in-class approach to driving, high-performance products.
Yeah, it's easy to be short-sighted on some of that stuff. I don't need it now because X or Y, but the faster you can accumulate data, the bigger the payoff is. It pays itself back much faster if you implement it today than if you wait, years. And I've seen a lot of our clients, even take more time to upgrade to get our A/B testing. And it's like the sooner you start testing, the faster you're going to scale lead flow, the faster you're going to scale your business. I think this is the same. Like the sooner you can do this, the faster you can eliminate churn or understand the leading indicators of churn or the leading indicator of upgrades, which is, allows you to double down sooner.
Absolutely. I mean, and you're talking about something that's really critical. I mean, I think people have understood they need to collect data for a long time. I mean, that's not necessarily a new conversation, but what is most often being tracked is transactional data within your application versus behavioral data. And so where advanced analytics goes is it's a combination, it's a marriage of transactional and behavioral data. So you can understand not just what somebody's doing, but you understand why they're doing it.
Now, once someone becomes a customer, so we've talked a lot about kind of the onboarding, information gathering. You've mentioned net retention once. You also talked about, Zynga thinking about the ripple effects of what happens when that leading indicator kind of hits. Where have you seen companies really nail kind of that customer experience to drive feature adoption? Obviously, you're helping people roll out digital products that I assume could potentially be add-ons or upgrades. Like, where have you seen really successful strategies for kind of that piece of the puzzle to improve net retention?
Well, I think net retention we see comes usually into four major areas that are driving some of the most successful strategies and tactics. One we've been talking about, which is understanding the motivations of your customers. That's a really big one. And that is making sure you have real clarity of as they move through the buyer's journey and then the actual customer lifetime cycle, through your product, that you actually understand both needs and motivations, and that those needs and their motivations are going to evolve over time, right? If you have somebody that's retained and habitually uses your product every single day, their needs and their cumulative value is going to be completely different from when they started if it's 12 months down the road. So you need to be able to segment your strategies based on time and dimension and benefit factors of your product and across your customer base. So that'd be one. The second one is really understanding, I'm going to just boil this down, but are you easy to do business with? Meaning, like, do you create intuitive and transparent experiences? So one of the easiest things is this idea of like, well, once we have the customer, let's not make it too easy to cancel with us. That's a horrible idea. And I'll be very specific. Google has an entire team of people that their job is to figure out how to make it as easy as possible to not do business with Google anymore. The reason for that is really, really profound and really important, which is, if you make it easy to not do business with you, one, that might not have been a good customer to have in the first place. And two, if you actually have that opportunity and you're making things easier, you have an opportunity for service recovery. Meaning you might be able to retain that relationship or even grow it and expand it versus just losing that customer because they're so frustrated, they'll just do anything to get out of their contract with you. And so service recovery is something that I don't think is given nearly enough of attention, that becomes a really big component of where the best customer success teams are thriving, because they make it super easy, really transparent, self-service opportunities for cancellation, but also an opportunity you use those to gather more actionable and more relevant insights, and then offer a service recovery moment or multiple moments across the experience. And this becomes super critical, especially depending on the market you're in. So imagine healthcare, like where you don't have as many options. Like if you have a bad patient experience with a digital platform, like service recovery is pretty critical in that case, because you're not just dealing with somebody's, general day-to-day. You're dealing with somebody who is in a high stress and potentially life-threatening situation based on the circumstances. So that element is really key and really does help drive significant changes in retention. Another one is making sure that you do have a path to guiding feature adoption and engagement. So there may be a core set of features that is tied to your initial value proposition of your product, and they really don't get the cumulative benefit of the product and the problems it can solve for them until they start to adopt other features. So past the onboarding and getting them through the core, what are you doing to engage them and educate them about the other features and benefits of the product? And how are you guiding them to see that cumulative increased benefit over time, or to invite more colleagues, or to expand the footprint of the product? And so that becomes really key. And then the fourth one is something we touched on a little bit as well, which is, what are the value multipliers? Do they understand, certain places like, have the value multiplier that's really common in certain areas is like network effect. The more people that are in the marketplace, the better and stronger the marketplace. If you have a platform and you're building a two-sided marketplace, whether it's two-sided consumer market or a supplier to buyer market, or any other type for that matter, there's that can be absolutely essential. So what are you doing to actually drive the value multipliers? Because those elements actually are intricate to keeping retained engagement in customers.
Can't agree more on those those fronts. I think we've even struggled with the downgrade flow, right? Like that's something you don't think about early, because you're not thinking about people canceling when you start a business. And it's interesting you mentioned Google. I just had an experience with them for a side hustle where I needed a Google Workplace account. So that's a really interesting one. I think the other one that we've been spending more time on recently is making it really easy to upgrade and building those flows into our product, as opposed to relying on third-party tools. How have you advised clients to kind of be agile in that space of like, hey, you're doing an add-on. Do you advise them to think about the how people upgrade thing and build it themselves? Do you advise them on using a third-party tool just for agility? I'd love some advice there because we're currently going through the throes of that today. So
Well, there are circumstances where both totally apply. I mean, candidly, but there's a lot of times I think that cross sell and upsell opportunities are best handled within the product itself, if possible. And it also depends on where it needs to sit. As an example, we worked with a client where they had a SaaS product, B2B focused. And one of the key things that they realized is that they needed to have more business intelligence around how people use their products so that their teams could go back to the client and say, you're getting X benefit, but here's the full potential of if you utilized our product further. And they were able to unlock hundreds of millions of dollars in their existing customer base because they could close the gap between the current level of value they are experiencing and the total potential of value because they understand product usage. And so I think when you look at upscaling in a product and you look at cross sell and promotional opportunities, you have to tie those to trigger moments around, do you understand how customers are using the product? Are you triggering these events? Are they able to handle self-service mechanisms? And then what's the infrastructure necessary on your end to support that? And in some cases, it makes way more sense to internalize that because it becomes such an intricate part of your customer experience and flow that you need to actually make sure that you have control over that environment in its totality. And so in a lot of our customers' cases, that is the fact. They need to actually own that as a key component of their environment. And there's just some critical touch points that they need to make sure that they are capturing intelligence on at all times.
love it, Jonathan. Last question we ask every guest. You can't say your own book. We'll plug that again though. It's a good one. I'm going to buy it and read it.
Okay.
2 books you recommend every founder reads. It can be business book, it can be a fiction, it can be whatever you want. But interested to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so 2 of my favorite books I think that everybody should read in the space. One is Hard Things About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. I just think he writes a phenomenal book that really gives, whether you're starting out as first-time business owner or you're an experienced CEO, his perspective on what it takes to the struggles and difficulties of leading and effectively growing and scaling a business, I think are just invaluable. And he provides just very, very direct brass tacks of how it goes and what he's gone through in his own career. And what I also love about that book in particular is that he bullet lists out so many pieces to it. I literally have a copy I go through almost every year just going, what can I take this year into the work that I do? He makes it very, very actionable, which is fantastic. The other one I would say is the book Inspired by Marty Kagan. It's kind of like the godfather of product management. His book is fantastic. I think there is a lot of misconception around what great product management is and what it takes to lead product. And he has really, I think, set the tone for how we need to think about product management. And he provides some really invaluable perspective and points of view from his decades of experience of helping some of the biggest companies develop and lead successful products. And it's really, you can get a lot from it at an individual level, but I think it's also an important book when you're thinking about building teams.
Love it. That's actually a new one. We've had The Hard Thing About Hard Things. That was one I actually recommended on our first episode. I love that book. You're spot on. It's you read it multiple times. I actually got it on Audible as well and listened to it, which him narrating it, I think it's better to read it yourself. But the best part about that book, and you mentioned this, is that guy's been through some shit. He's been at the highest of highs and some pretty low lows, not totally catastrophic, but he navigated the choppy waters very well, or at least he tells the story of him doing it. And I think that's so helpful for people to hear that. It's so easy to get, all the highlights of businesses that are overnight successes without knowing what the hell was going on behind the scenes. And I think some of the behind the scenes stuff he gave was just awesome to hear and listen and read through.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I think it's rare when you can find a book sometimes where I don't think I've ever known a founder who hasn't been laying awake at night just wondering, how am I going to figure this or get through the next day, or how am I going to have this tough conversation with my team? And the fact that Ben just puts it out there, there he is in the same position, just at a different scale, right? I mean, in some of those things, it's like you realize, wow, I'm not alone. These are really hard things to figure out, hence the name of the book. And it's like there's a reason why it takes so much grit and commitment to get through, and bring products to fruition. And he puts a real honest spotlight on that.
Yeah. And if you're going through a pivot, like go and read this book now, because you're going to start to feel and understand what that might take, and where the value is in your business, which is another thing he kind of uncovered. And I think it's just super interesting to read through that stuff. And I love your point about reading through it multiple times for different phases of your journey as a founder or a business leader, because every time I've read a book multiple times, I look at it totally differently. I missed this on the podcast the other day, but I'm rereading Never Split the Difference, and I'm reading it as a podcast host, not as a sales rep. When the first time I read it, I was a boots on the ground sales rep picking up the phone, getting hung up on. Now I'm reading it as a podcast host, thinking about how can you interview and open up doors and have different conversations that are meaningful. And it's incredibly helpful. It's a totally different part of my life and totally different framing on it. But I think you're a great point to reread books when you're at different phases of your life.
Yeah, they completely change their meaning. I have a handful of books like that. I mean, one other one that, if you don't mind, I shamelessly throw out there, not that I have any affiliation to it, is another book I read every year is a book called The Speed of Trust by Stephen M.R. Covey. A lot of people are familiar with Stephen Covey's work. His father wrote, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People and all of these other very, very popular business books. But the insights in that book into, what are the multipliers for some of the most successful businesses? What is the difference? And, how do you build teams that seem to operate at a speed that nobody else can, compete with it's formulaic. I mean, it's amazing understanding of just how people operate when there's a high trust environment versus a low trust environment. I've read that book every year for a decade. I get new insights out of it every time.
Love it. Love it. That's a good one. And I'll give one more: Alignment, Overcome Internal Sabotage, and Digital Product Failure. Jonathon, thank you so much for joining me today. Where can everyone connect with you or get in touch?
If they're interested in connecting, reach out to me on LinkedIn. It's a great place to connect and to follow some of the stuff that we're doing. And also, please check out emergeinteractive.com.
Awesome. Jonathon, thank you so much for joining me today.
Zach, thanks so much for having me.